employees long for human connection, right? And we know communication is a key driver of employee experience and engagement. It's just those connections are different now. You're not stopping into somebody's office and saying hello. You're popping in on a Zoom meeting or a Slack or a team call. But it's not like human connection goes away.
Hey everyone, welcome to PeopleMetrics Live. Today we're going to be helping you get your employee experience program ready for a great year in 2021 with some tips, tricks, and best practices from our team to yours. If you've got questions for our team, please drop them in the comments below and we'll be sure to answer them. All right, let's just jump right into it. So guys, why should employee experience be a top priority in 2021?
Well, thanks, Madeline. It's important to think about the employee experience because it's so important to almost everything else at the company, especially as it's changed so much going into 2021. But before we even get into any of the changes, why would one even worry about the employee experience? There's a couple things. One, it links directly to the customer experience, which we know is important. It also links directly to employee retention and discretionary effort, meaning getting the very most out of every employee every day. And they also tend to recruit better people who have a great experience and are engaged, reducing your recruiting costs. And there's a bunch of other reasons as well. Kirk, what would you say to that question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's just a win-win-win all around. Not only is everyone just having a better day to day every single day, but then that leads to all those other benefits. Employee experience really is a bedrock to building a successful organization, especially now, given that this past year has been so different for every organization. So much has changed that it really is essential this year, especially to check in. You can't assume that you know what's going on in the employee experience really ever, and especially this year. So it's really important that you check in and understand what is my employee experience that we're delivering today.
Great. So why don't we talk a little bit about some of the changes that we've seen since February of this year and how the experience of employees have changed, both people who are in person at the office or in a factory or facing customers every day, or people who are now fully remote, which we know there's a lot too. And Alexander, I'd love to get your thoughts on it too. What have we seen change? Let's start with people who are remote, and that's more and more people these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely the employee experience has changed for every single employee in the workforce. No one is kind of left out of this. However, the way it's changed for you is going to be different depending on really fundamentally whether you are working remotely or whether you are working in person with other employees and with customers. With remote, there are a few base needs that you're going to have as an employee that are just suddenly harder to satisfy, or you're going to need to adjust how you satisfy these needs if it is remote. At the base, it's going to be resources. So all your employees who used to be in an office now are working at home. Do they have the same resources to maintain that productivity? Not even be as productive, but be able to do fundamentally what they need to do. There's also the cultural aspect, things that you just got to rely on employees just having conversations, having day-to-day interactions that happen organically. Suddenly that's not organic. Suddenly you have to make that happen on your own. And the work-life balance is another big one I would highlight as far as that work and the home space is melded together. And you need to be, as someone in HR or as an employer, mindful and cognizant of how do we maintain a work-life balance, both so people are aware that we need to be taking time off, even though it feels like you're just home all the time. So you're not getting burnout, you're not getting churned with this adjustment. Those are some of the key ones.
So Alexander, you've been in the thick of this, right, since February. Why don't you give a few thoughts on how you've seen PeopleMetrics workplace change since February compared to today, with some of the things Kirk was saying.
Yes, and to balance a little bit off of what Kirk was saying about the work-life balance, another thing that I've seen repeatedly is making sure you're encouraging employees to have a morning and end of day routine, because even though it sounds so simple as commuting back and forth, that really actually helps employees give a time in the morning, give some time to collect their thoughts, and at the end of the day, wind down before going home, which now that's taken away. So encouraging that morning and end of day routine is a big theme I've been seeing in a lot of the research I've been doing. And with PeopleMetrics, it's definitely been a transition. We did have employees work remotely here and there, but it was never implemented as a full remote force until March 12th. So one of the things, even companies that have been remote since prior to COVID, what's different during COVID is you can't meet in person. Even if you have a remote team, when it's safe, you should be having at least once a quarter, a time where you have everyone within your company, or if you're a larger company, departments meet in person, both days for strategizing on work, and also just time to spend together, whether it's a happy hour or a escape room activity. That's something you should still be doing regardless if you're remote. Now in COVID, it's hard to do those. Obviously, you can't meet in person. And some of you might know that there's a lot of virtual events that you can attend. There's virtual scavenger hunts, virtual trivia, and even just a virtual coffee break with the teams. And even if not everyone attends, it's still good to maintain that good culture and make sure that the employees are still connecting on some level. So that's a big part of it, is making sure that there's still that human connection. And also just making sure that you're having one-on-ones with managers, having one-on-ones with your direct reports, and also just the company-wide having either a weekly company meeting or something where you're still all together and able to communicate via Zoom. Now, a lot of times there's conversations on Slack or emails or things of that nature, and things get lost in communications. That's why it's really important, that face-to-face.
Yeah, so obviously remote, if you've gone remote from being in person, your employees' experience have changed radically. There's been a couple ideas that Alexandra and Kirk has shared that you really need to consider and measure and try to figure out how are employees feeling about these changes and what you can do to make it as best of an experience as possible. Employees long for human connection, right? And we know communication is a key driver of employee experience and engagement. And it's just those connections are different, as Alexandra was saying just now. You're not stopping in somebody's office and saying hello. You're popping in on a Zoom meeting or a Slack or a team call. But you can't, it's not like human connection goes away. In fact, I think at PeopleMetrics, my guess is we see each other more face to face than we ever have when we were in the office. There were times, and it used to drive me a little crazy when people would Slack each other when they were their offices would be next to each other, and I saw them Slacking back and forth. I'm like, well, why aren't you just talking to each other? Now we're encouraging people to hop on a call like this, a Zoom or a Slack or Teams, to really connect from human to human. So there's lots of things. I think the big picture is you have to figure out what do you want to measure around the changes to remote workforce experience.
Hi, it's Madeline. Thanks for joining us for PeopleMetrics Live. If this is your first time watching, PeopleMetrics Live is a weekly live webinar session where experts from our team answer your questions about customer, employee, and patient experience measurement and management. We've been doing this for almost 2 decades now, and this is a great way for us to share our knowledge with you. You can sign up for upcoming sessions at www.peoplemetrics.com/events and bring a friend.
But there's also changes in person, right? It's not like the whole workforce is remote. There's still a lot of people showing up at a factory, at a retail store, or even at times, right, Alexander, we've talked about this before, professional companies doing shifts of workers going into the office so there's not too many people in at the same time. And all of those experiences have to be radically different than they were before.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's, when it comes to employee experience, I think the most just fundamental thing about it is we've talked about how employee experience matters, and that's why you have to measure it. And if you've measured it in the past, whatever you knew from the past has totally changed. And you don't know what you haven't asked about, because it's often hard to, you can't assume these things. You have to ask and find out what's missing. We've talked about this internally of, even when it comes to resources of, do you have a pen and paper? Do you have a monitor? Do you have a laptop? Alexander's talked about this before, that we've had to ask those things and make sure those things, so people don't necessarily volunteer it. And so there are any gaps with this transition that you're just not going to know unless you measure it, which is why employee experience measurement this year more than ever is so essential.
And if you're in person, that it applies there too. It's just different, right? If you're working in a store, do you have personal, the PPE available for you? Are the customers spaced out? Do you have sanitation stations? Do you feel safe? And just like, can I get to work on time in a safe way? There's so much that's changed that people didn't even think about before. People didn't think about, am I going to be safe on my commute to work, right? They were thinking about, can I get to work on time? Now it's, am I going to be safe? Is transportation even running? There's so many things going through your people's minds that weren't before. And it's just really important to consider them all when you're thinking about a measurement program. Anything else we want to talk about there on how the experience has changed due to COVID? Kirk, Alexandra?
Those are the big ones for me. I think it's changed in a big way is the takeaway. That's for sure.
Yes, and really also just clarity is key. That's another big theme I've seen, is just something that might seem like common sense to you may or likely not make sense to another employee. So just making sure that whether it's a guideline or just things like what Kirk was mentioning, needing supplies, you want to make sure whatever processes you put together, employees are fully aware of them and understand them.
Yeah, it's hard to over communicate, especially when you're not seeing each other face to face.
And that's another thing, is any softwares that your company uses that integrate together, integrate them. Like utilizing anything that makes it simple for employees to look up any kind of document or anything that they need to complete their job. That is also a big key thing, is integrate any softwares you have that can. And,
I can't imagine doing this, being remote like 5 years ago without things like what we're on today. It's really hard to imagine it. Zoom and others. All right, Kirk. So we're sitting with a client and they're trying to prepare for next year, and they want to do a great job in terms of measuring and improving the employee experience. Where would you have them begin? Like, what would you recommend they start?
Yeah, and that's I think a core thing. We've talked about so far kind of why employee experience matters, why it especially matters this year. And I think if you're on this call, you're going to understand that. And generally, anytime you're starting an employee experience program where there's some regular measurement, some feedback program on the employee experience, it always starts with building the business case to leadership. None of these programs are successful without buy-in from leadership, and really then that helps with getting buy-in all the way down to communicate these things. So first, if this is a program that's new to you, or even if this is something you're already doing and you're just trying to build and expand upon it and say how, given how critical it is this year, you want to build that business case. And so generally when we're talking to our clients, it is really about the linkage between employee experience and to employee retention, customer experience, and customer loyalty. It's very clear and easy to make that link. And then especially kind of with the changes that have happened in the workplace this year.
Yeah, I think how do you build that business case? One, you talk about how important a great employee experience is to retention, which leads to not using recruiters to replace people, right? Turnover is very disruptive. You talked about how it links to bringing in new talent that's very good, and it links to the customer experience itself, right? So at a high level, there's lots of information online that you can use to put that together. But then it's about all the things we just talked about, right? The experience has changed so much from COVID. You just have to reach out and get feedback from employees on where they are today. And you have to include and acknowledge that things have changed and get people's thoughts on that as well. So I think that would be all part of the business case if I were to suggest, something to the audience.
Definitely. So you want to start by building that business case. The second thing is to think about who is it that you want to reach out to. And this year we recommend reaching out to absolutely everyone, your full employee base. With employee experience studies in the past, that isn't always the case. Sometimes you have folks who just say, we only have maybe emails for a tenth of our employees, or we only do certain warehouses or something like that.
Yep.
This year, there are blind spots potentially throughout your organization that even a year into COVID, you haven't heard about, and you need to find out. So make sure you're thinking of who is every employee that we can reach out to.
That's right. And make sure you have a list of them. Make sure that you can reach out to them. We know there are certain businesses where you may not have email addresses or a way to contact them digitally. And that's something to really think about, because people are reluctant to be using a kiosk where you're touching a pad, or even paper surveys a lot of times these days. There are other ways to do that. You can put like a unique code in their like a place where they would receive any kind of communication from you, like in a piece of paper. You could have a unique code and a URL. Even people who don't have email addresses linked to their employer probably have a phone that they can go on and fill out a survey as well. So you want to think about how you can digitize as much as possible of the feedback mechanism as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So think through all the employees and then how you can possibly reach these employees. That's going to be the core thing.
Did you know that you can watch past sessions of PeopleMetrics Live right here on our YouTube channel? Be sure to check them out for answers to dozens of questions, along with stories, tips, and best practices from our team of experts. Click the bottom right corner of this video to subscribe to our channel so you never miss an update.
Once you've gotten your kind of arms around, all right, what is it that we're looking to do? You know, we built a business case, we know who we want to reach out to. Think about your time frame. And generally, of course, if you haven't done an employee survey recently, the sooner the better. We're coming into a new year. That's a great time to just kick off the year with a survey. So January, February is a great time to start it, and then kind of keep building on your program from there.
Yeah, I mean, think about your first one. You hear a lot of things called pulses this year, in the past and now and in the future. Pulse, in general, meant, okay, we're going to survey a small percentage of our employees that represent the larger population. But these days, I would throw that idea out. I would use Pulse as a way to survey all of your employees and just make it a shorter survey. So one of the things I'll have you think about is, let's think about your first survey next year being longer, more in depth, probably has some COVID questions, probably has some typical questions you would ask on an employee survey. And then your maybe pulse would be in June or July around, you know, what are the most important initiatives that you have going on, or the most important things you want to measure. And then maybe do another one in the fall. Again, a smaller in terms of questions, but goes to everyone at the organization. So everybody feels left included, right? Alexandra, I mean, if you have people who are not surveyed, I would imagine that would probably be a sore spot for certain people, especially with the uncertainty these days.
Yeah, I mean, especially now, employee feedback is very important in making sure your company survives this. And even, you know, Kirk and Sean had mentioned putting in COVID questions. You know, even if there is a vaccine that comes out, let's say spring, it's going to take a while for things to get back to normal and for people to be comfortable, whether it's in person or remote. So that's really another thing to consider. It is important to put some of these COVID-related questions in. I
mean, the most important thing this is a great point, Alexandra. The most important thing in any employee experience measurement effort is the questions you're asking. It's not the software you're choosing. It's not who's getting what, it's what are you asking? And Kirk, what would be some questions you would recommend, like almost all companies ask on an employee experience survey?
Well, certainly kind of a core one, just a fundamental, is eNPS, or the Employee Net Promoter Score, which I think if you've done this kind of survey before, that's something you'd be familiar with. But with any survey, you want that baseline. How likely would you recommend, or how satisfied are you? That gives you that pulse, that understanding. And another key benefit to using eNPS is that there are benchmarks, you know, for that. So you can have that comparison and understand kind of how does this relate to other organizations.
Right. So that's a question that asks, you know, how likely are you to recommend your company, the company, to a friend or family who's considering, you know, considering working at the company, right? And it's a scale of zero, right? It's 0, very unlikely, to 10, very likely. And that gives you a really good indication of their level of engagement and their overall experience. And then you also want to ask why, right? So you want to give them a chance to say, why did you give that rating? And that will give quite a bit of information.
And that's also another reason why it is so important to do employee feedback, is because you also get to see as a company what you're doing right and how you can expand on those areas.
That's right. So exactly, Alexander. So people are going to be promoters, right? People who say 9 and 10 on the NPS question are considered promoters. The people who are saying 0 to 6 are considered detractors, right? So a lot of companies focus only on what the 0 to 6 people say, right? And they share that and they feel bad, but the 9s and 10s are going to say some things that are very positive. And it's important, right, Alexander, to look at that, understand it, and share that as well.
I mean, the good feedback is just as important, if anything, almost a little more, because a happy employee is an employee that is likely doing a good job because they enjoy where they're working or who they're working for and with. So that positive feedback is just as important to get as well. So that's another thing to really keep in mind when you're doing an employee feedback program.
Kirk, the NPS tells us kind of where we are with regard to overall experience, but it's not telling us why that. I mean, the open end is telling us a little bit why, but we have to dig into it, right? We have to have other questions that hit some other areas. Just give us a flavor for what are some of those other areas you'd recommend us?
Yeah, absolutely. And so generally, and I think the way you framed it is exactly right. You want to know why. And so we have our own particular survey instrument called EX14, this employee, there's 14 questions that are built around the drivers of the employee experience. They're generally kind of bucketed into broad categories of what we find employees really care about. So it's starting at that baseline with resources. Sort of, do you have the resources to do what you need in order to complete my job? Another thing that is in there is culture, of how much do you enjoy kind of your day-to-day work experience. Another core thing is recognition. That can do you feel appreciated kind of by your manager? Do you feel that your work, and this is something we did another webinar session about, do you feel connected to the customer and what you do? That's very key, of feeling an impact to the work that you're completing. So it's going to cover ultimately those broad buckets of why, which are commonly around the resources you have, the recognition you receive, the culture, and how much you enjoy that day to day, as well as a number of little subcategories beneath that.
Yeah, I mean, you want to definitely ask about COVID. You want to ask about the changes in the work environment. You want to ask about, what are we doing now that really is working, and what could we be doing differently that'll make the experience improve.
Our founder and CEO, Sean, wrote an amazing book about customer experience measurement called Listen or Die, 40 Lessons That Turn Customer Feedback into Gold. It's a deep dive into best practices for CX measurement based off his years of experience in the space, and you can easily read it front to back on an airplane ride. Be sure to check it out. It's available now on Amazon.
But then you got to get to also the core building blocks of a great experience. And whether you're remote, whether you're in person, et cetera, people need resources to do their job, right? People need to feel comfortable in terms of working with the other people at the organization. People need to be able to people need recognition and rewards. And they also need to trust senior leadership, and senior leadership needs to be communicative to the organization, and you need to measure that, even more so now than ever. Like, I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there. This wasn't part of our plan, but compared to pre-COVID, are we communicating more or less at PeopleMetrics? What would you all say from a leadership perspective?
I would say more, I think.
I would say it's more, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
What do you think, Madeline?
More, I'd say more, but also differently, right? Because it used to be, we had a big in-person company meeting and all those types of things. And so, now we're doing our updates we've gotten into a routine with, especially on our company meetings that are now remote, hearing from all different members of the leadership team, giving, updates and everything. I think we actually have, more locked in focus on those types of things. There's more communications obviously on things like Slack or Teams, and our, update meetings that we're having daily or weekly, as a team. So.
I mean, go ahead.
Prior to COVID, we did still have, like Madeline was saying, weekly company meetings in person. And what we used to do, we had a thank you rock, and each week whoever got it the prior week would give it to someone else within the company and thank them for something outstanding they did that week. And once we started going remote, Sean had us during the company meetings each person going around saying one thing they're generally grateful for, and then a shout out to someone within the company, which has been really great. And more recently, we've actually been connecting our shout outs to our company values, which that's also been a great addition, and just kind of keeps us all on the same page of what our company goals are. And just, it's important for people to feel appreciated, especially when so many people are isolated at home.
That's so right. Like, I think no matter where we are in this, in terms of pandemic or not pandemic, the number one thing that people want and employees want too, of course, is connection with others, right? And when you lack a connection, that's when you kind of get lost in both your life and in your work life, right? And I knew that as soon as we couldn't see each other, that we needed to keep that connection or even enhance it, because it's just too easy to go off in the other direction. We're not seeing, out of sight, out of mind type thing. And I was determined not to have that happen. And so if anything, I think we are communicating even more than ever. And if somebody tells me we're over communicating, I take that as a compliment. All right. So anything else, Kirk? What about sharing? How would you plan to share the feedback? Like, what would your plan be on that one?
Yeah, and that's a great, because that really is the last step after this. And we've talked about a lot of things that are very important. Of course, that leadership buy-in is very important, and perhaps one of the second to that is, what are you actually doing with it? Once you get it, how are you actually sharing that data out throughout the organization? And so it's hard to actually do anything with your employee feedback data if no one's seen it and no one knows what the results were. So make sure that you have a plan, if you're starting a feedback program, to actually share it out within the organization. Now, all of that should be done within the parameters of keeping a sort of safeguard. So employee anonymity is kept, and you're not sharing it if the results are kind of too low as far as how many responses you've collected. However, you want to make sure that everyone throughout the organization, whether that's at a manager level, at the individual employee, at districts or regions or locations, all the way up to leadership, that they have their results in a way that's easy for you to share, so they know kind of what are their results and what are they responsible for.
Absolutely. All right, Madeline, we're right at 2:30 now.
Yes, we are. You guys are just great at keeping it right on schedule. So yeah, just looking at some questions that we had come in. One is, do you recommend using a third party for employee experience or doing this in-house? And what are the pros and cons of doing it either way?
Right. Well, the number one pro of using a partner is you don't have to worry about the anonymity of the responses. So the third party can handle that for you. They can also help with reporting and making sure all the employees feel like it was a process where they could share their true feelings without any problems whatsoever. What would you say to that, Kirk? Are there some other pros or cons that you could think of from using a third party?
Yeah, to me, an employee experience program, to do it right, I mean, we've gone through a lot of steps. You have to manage it correctly if you want to do it right. Otherwise, if the experience I found, you can do it on your own, but unless you really are ready to do it right, you're kind of just spinning your wheels. The benefit to me of working with a third party is that that's a dedicated resource that plans to actually think through, how do we get the buy-in? How are we reaching out to folks? What are the questions? How are we sharing it? And so that's it takes work to get that right, but that's kind of the purpose behind doing it.
Absolutely. Any other questions we have, Madeline?
Yeah, I've got one more, which is how do we handle negative feedback for things that are out of our control?
That's just a great question. What I would say is, there definitely is going to be that. You will get feedback that is negative that you can't control. I think what the key is acknowledge it, be upfront with people that you've heard them, and also be upfront that there are some things that we can't change, and this might be one of them, at least right now, right? So I think that's always the best course. I guess a final word would be, there'll be a lot of pieces of feedback you get when you do one of these things, and you'll want to try to tackle them all and improve everything at once, but don't do that. Focus on one item that you think will have the largest impact on your culture and your employee experience. Focus on that. Tell everybody you're going to focus on that. Explain what you're doing over time, and then when you remeasure, hopefully that area improves. The worst thing you can do is have lots and lots of priorities and not get any of them done.
Right. And I'm sure there'll be, a theme potentially if you're measuring that you can focus on one at a time. So thank you. Thanks for that. And yeah, it looks like, again, we're right at time. So thank all of you for this session today. This has been a really good conversation about what we can do to get our employee experience measurement programs ready for next year. And hey, thank you for joining us for PeopleMetrics Live. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe right here so you never miss an update. And have you checked out the other sessions of PeopleMetrics Live yet? You can click right here to watch them all. I'll see you there.